If you like listening to Warriors in Their Own Words, check out our other show, the Medal of Honor podcast. The link is in the show description. I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Warriors in Their Own Words. In partnership with the Honor Project, we've brought this podcast back at a time when our nation needs these stories more than ever. Warriors in Their Own Words is our attempt to present an unvarnished, unsanitized truth of what we have asked of those who defend this nation. Thank you for listening, and by doing so, honoring those who have served. Today, we'll hear from Captain Warren Bing Evans. Evans served as an Army Ranger in World War II. In this final part of his interview, Evans recounts the Italian campaign, including the battles of Monte Cassino, Anzio, and Cisterna, and describes being captured and escaping from a prisoner of war camp in Poland.
Venafro starts at Naples and opens up in a northerly direction across the boot and narrows down into almost a funnel shape. At the end of that, in that funnel, they sat atop of a mountain there, and they were observing us, and every time we'd try to advance, they'd throw the book at us. It's a beautiful valley, ringed on both sides with mountains. The old monarchy used to have their castle there. Now it was a hospital. We used it for a hospital. Colonel Darby, at that time, was colonel. I was in the 3rd Battalion, and I was a lieutenant commanding a company. And he asked me to take a patrol on top of that mountain to see what we could find. And of course, the one thing that most people don't realize is the fact that Rangers there's no way to count the number of patrols that would infiltrate through the lines, come up in behind and get in amongst them and find out what they'd have. That was a lot of our expertise. So I did. I took a patrol up there and found out what was on top of the mountain and came back and reported to the colonel. And he said, "Do you think you can take the top of that mountain with your company?" And I said, "Yes, I think I can." So he said, "Good. Tonight you take your company up there and take it." Well, I took my company up there and we took what we thought was the top of the mountain. But it winds up that in daylight, there are 2 tops. And there's a gully there. It was pretty sheer on one side and pretty sheer on the other. They couldn't reach us, and we couldn't reach them. They'd pick us off like flies. And I reported that to the colonel, and I don't think you want to hear some of the words he used, but in essence, he said, "I don't care what you do, get the other side of that mountain." I thought about it for a while, and I did something, on top of a mountain, your voice carries like you're in the same room. And I yelled over and I said, "Can anyone over there speak English?" And the voice came back as though you were answering me. He said, "Yes, I can." I said, "Fine, this is an unusual situation. Why don't we declare a truce, and I'll stand up over here and you stand up over there, and let's talk this situation over." He said, "Okay." And I said, "Well, give me 5 minutes." He said, "Well, let's make it 10. Which gave me an indication he might have had more over there than I thought he had. But at any rate, at the end of that time, I yelled over and I said, "Are you ready?" He said, "Yes, but you stand up first." So I did. And then he stood up. Now, I'll skip a lot of the story. For 3 days there, we had a truce every afternoon about that same time. And we couldn't quite throw the souvenirs far enough to get back and forth, but I found out his name was Hans. That's all I knew. He was in this country at the Michigan State at the Kellogg Center learning hotel management. His father and mother ran the largest hotel in the center of Leipzig, Germany. And in the meantime, we had patrols coming up in and around, and we knew pretty much what they had, and we knew what we had to do. And so they sent a paratroop colonel up. He was going to send the company up to relieve us. And I was pointing out to him where they had the sharpshooters, where they had the machine gun emplacement, where I thought their headquarters was. And every time I'd say something like that, he'd come back and say, "There's nothing over there, Lieutenant." And I'd say something else, and he'd say, "Lieutenant, there's not a damn thing over there." And finally, in exasperation, he stood right straight up and he said, "Lieutenant, there's not a damn thing over there. Why haven't you taken the other side of that mountain?" And it was then that Hans stood up on the other side, nursing his burp gun, and said, "He hasn't been here long, has he, Lieutenant?" And those are stories you don't usually hear. Um, we infiltrated through. I gave the order to try to take Hans alive. He would never tell me his name. He did tell me that the reason he could not come over, I tried to talk him into a steak dinner. I hadn't seen one in 2 years. I tried to talk him into coming over, and I'd introduce him to a Red Cross girl. He was interested, but I hadn't seen a Red Cross girl either, although I heard we had them. But anyway, I gave the orders to take him alive if we could, but he was killed that night. Now there's a sequel to that story. I spent 15 months in a prison camp. I escaped 3 times. Twice I was recaptured. The 3rd time I made it to the American lines at the Elbe River, and they took me to Leipzig, Germany. And the headquarters of the 5th Army was in a hotel in the center of Leipzig, Germany. And I asked some questions because all of a sudden the thought went through my mind. Hans, Leipzig, Germany, hotel. As you know, you'd get to thinking about it, and I found out that it was owned by an old couple. And I couldn't find them for a long time, but a MP was helping me, and he found an old couple that he thought might be the couple. And I went to them. They were about a mile from the hotel, and in a little 3-room apartment. She was short and squat. Sitting here as I am now, she wasn't much taller than I was. He was about as tall as I was and very spare. And their name was Schuler. I didn't tell him any story at the time, but I had got orders to move out. So I went to see him the last time, and Mrs. Schuler, knowing it was the last time, said to me, "You know something about our Hans, don't you?" And I told her the story, and she put her arms around me. I cried. And she put her arms around me and leaned her head on top of me and said, "Thank you for that. Thank you." Now, those are stories you don't often get told, and my outfit is filled with them. At the time of Salerno, no, it was, you knew what you had to do, but you realized also that you were a vulnerable human. Up until this time, you were a well-trained soldier, and you were a little better than they were. But now you're beginning to realize that you've been watered down a little bit, that the group that came out of Scotland and landed in North Africa was not the same organization that you still had, although you had the heart of it, the guts of it, was still the old Rangers. I would say when we landed in Salerno that we were only at 40 or 50% strength from the originals. And by the time we were at Anzio, we were probably 20%. Because by that time we'd fought through San Pietro and the rest, So really the organization that went into Anzio, the Cisterna part of it, I would say that if we were 20%, would be strong. Today, I don't imagine that there are more than half a dozen of us that started with them and ended with them, left alive today. Now, understand many of those we've lost recently. We had met pretty much a stone wall at Monte Cassino, and we had to do something to break their stranglehold on that, and we were mounting up casualties trying to get through that particular area. So we went in behind them again, landed behind them, and that was the purpose of Anzio, was to cut the Apennine Highway, which was feeding the troops to the south and refueling the troops at Cassino. That was the main purpose of it. Now, there's a lot more went into it than that as far as detail, but that was the main purpose. Anzio Now, this landing was different than all the others for me. I don't know about the others, but this was my fourth landing. And I operated pretty much the whole landing in a vacuum. The best way I can explain that vacuum is if you saw Saving Private Ryan, you saw moments of dead silence where action was going on, but there was no sound. This is the way it was at Anzio for me. I was operating in a vacuum. I seemed to have done everything right. And we landed, and it was a very successful landing, and we didn't have many casualties. And we got 7 miles inland. That little force that we had was 7 miles inland, and I had a patrol on the Albion Hills overlooking Rome before they pulled us back onto the Anzio beachhead, which was one of the biggest mistakes we ever made. We should have gone on to the Albion Hills and established ourselves there instead of down on the beachhead plain. That's a long way around to tell you that after 3 invasions, the 4th one, I operated in a vacuum. Our initial plan was to take the port of Anzio and to move inland and protect the troops that were to land the next day. They landed without incident. I mean, there was no problem. We had almost our full force into a beachhead that was 7 or 8 miles deep, and that was it, probably 15 miles long. And then we sat there and waited while they built up their forces. It was a mistake. As far as the man in the field was concerned, it was a big mistake. When we landed in Anzio, and we got 3 or 4 miles inland, and were told to hold up for a minute, I heard this child crying. And evidently in the barrage beforehand, she'd been separated from her family, or they had been killed, and she was whimpering, cold, hungry, wet, miserable. And we found this little girl. I don't think she could have been more than 5 or 6 years old, and that's an interesting story in itself. But anyway, I picked her up, and for the next day or two before we were ordered to move out again, why, she would cling to me, and we got her dry and got her fed, and she climbed into my bedroll with me, and anyway, we got pretty close. So it came time for us to have to move out again. We'd received orders, and so the story had gotten back about her. I called her my little angel because she couldn't understand me, but somehow or another she knew that I had a soft spot for her, my little angel. And so they sent a nurse up in a Jeep to pick her up. And they took her back, and of course, then we advanced, and I had lost track of my little angel. But today, the only statue in all of Anzio is a statue to Angelica, the angel of Anzio, the little girl with the doves, peaceful doves flying around her head. That's the only one on the beach where we landed. And yeah, that's a story that's easily verified. And as it turned out, whether it's true or not, the nurse and the little girl were hit by an artillery shell and were killed before they got back to where they were going to the hospital. And that's the story of Angelica. Now, when we were there 50 years later, why, all of a sudden 2 or 3 Angelicas came out of the woodwork. But the real story of the angel of Anzio, Angelica, was one that we started, my little angel. We landed, I think it was the 22nd of January, and we were in Cisterna on the 30th of January. That's when we were annihilated. We were sent there because Cisterna sat astraddle the Apennine Highway, and so the beach hadn't yet accomplished its objective. And so we were sent in. We had been so successful in all the previous action, we were sent in to infiltrate through the lines in 2 battalion strength this time to take Cisterna di Littoria and straddle the Apennine Highway and cut the supply line to Cassino. That was the objective that we were told about. The night that we were briefed for this, Colonel Darby and Colonel Dammer were briefing us for that. Colonel Dammer was his executive of the force now, and our commander was Alva Miller, Major Alva Miller. And we were told that night that there was a headquarters of a paratroop brigade and a few scattered outposts. One of the old-timers left today is a man named Les Kness. He sort of followed in my footsteps all the way along. Les was commanding F Company of the 4th Battalion. I was commanding F Company of the 3rd Battalion. As they briefed us, I knew that they were wrong because I had had patrols there, and I knew that they had brought up a lot of armor. I knew they had a lot of troops in that area. And so when we were told what they had, I spoke up and said, Colonel, there's a lot more there than has been indicated, and we're running into a buzzsaw. The only man to back me up was Les Kness. We were the 2 old-timers. At that time, Colonel Darby, very West Point and very proper, said, those are my orders, those are your orders. This was the time we were going to take our whipping. You knew it had to come sometime. You knew we couldn't keep on just being successful. Raid after raid after raid, invasion after invasion after invasion. 19 major battles, 4 invasions, 6 campaigns. You knew that sometime you were going to make a mistake. It's a mistake we didn't make, but it's a mistake we paid for. You know, today, you take 17 or 18 days in combat, and the Army pulls you out of it because they know that that's about all a human being can stand, and here we'd been in it for 2.5 years. And so you in order to survive, you operate in that vacuum. That's just all there is to it. I got a notice from Joe Larkin, who was the lead of the 3rd Battalion, that they were in serious trouble and that they needed my help. So I went the entire length of the column and got up there to where they were. And now I can anticipate the next question. Why? Because part of our training and part of the mystique of the Ranger is you never leave a fallen comrade on the battlefield. You always protect them or take them out or fight with them or die with them. You never leave them. And you ask me why, if I had the feeling that I could have fought my way back, why I would negotiate the whole column and get up there where the fighting was the thickest, the hardest. Because of that. I just couldn't leave a fallen comrade. That's part of the creed today. The 75th Ranger Regiment, if you've studied anything about them, you know that their creed is never to leave a fallen comrade. On the hills of San Pietro, that overlook San Pietro, we had to get those before we could get through San Pietro. The battle for San Pietro was fought over several weeks. And Hill 950 or something like that, the Germans controlled. And we had to have that, and here again I had a patrol in and around and amongst them. And I led the battalion up a night or two later, and we got in amongst them, and we took our hill. I don't know what outfit it was supposed to take the hill that was next to ours, but they didn't make it. I think it was a 82nd Airborne outfit of some kind or another, because they were in that area. But they didn't take theirs, and as a result, they were looking down our throats and firing on us from the next mountain. top, and so we started to advance on that. Well, now it's broad daylight. And they started dropping rifle grenades in on us, and the colonel said, you better fight your way back and rejoin the battalion. And so we did, but a man named Earl Parrish, who had received a battlefield commission and was one of my platoon leaders, officer, a second lieutenant, one of those grenades had fallen on him and had pretty much torn him up. And so we had to fight a rear guard action to get him back down the mountainside. In so doing, I got a Silver Star for that action. Earl Parrish gave his life. He died. We didn't make it. But it's this type of thing. We weren't going to leave him on that mountainside, and we didn't. And outside of one man, and you probably have met him, Randall Harris, is the only man that even received a Distinguished Service Cross in the Rangers, in the original Rangers. No man has had a Congressional Medal of Honor. Colonel Darby used to say, who would I give it to? And so occasionally we'd get a Silver Star, and that was quite an honor. Randall Harris got his because he stood in line with his guts hanging out after he, on the Gila landing, stood in line to wait to get to the medical aid station. And he still commanded in that condition, commanded his company. He had received a battlefield commission. You get a very successful athletic team, football team, undefeated, and all of a sudden they go into another game and they get pretty cocky. Perhaps it's cockiness. I don't know. Perhaps it's overconfidence. Perhaps it's an exaggerated sense of your own ability. But I would rather think it's exactly what I told you. It's just the fact that you owed the loyalty to the men involved. At this time, fatalism was much a part of my whole being. I didn't expect that I would ever get home. In fact, my last thought as I was falling, hitting the ground, and as I say, I never remember hitting the ground, wasn't my life flashing before me like people make a big thing about, or I didn't see a bright light at the end of the tunnel. My only reaction was, well, this is it. And that's kind of the way I went into action at that time. Well, this is it. I can remember the ground coming up to hit me, but I can never remember hitting the ground. I have no memory of the last part of that day. I've often been accused of having what they call fugue, F-U-G-U-E, where I have deliberately shut it out of my memory. There's a possibility that that's the case, but I don't think it is. I didn't come to, although I have flashes of remembering something. I think the first time I escaped, for instance, I can remember the dogs. I don't remember the escape itself. I'm only what I have been told. But I do remember those dogs were on my trail, and that wondering as they came up there whether they were going to tear me apart before the guards ever got there. Ed Krice, who was a past president of the Rangers, was my medic at the time. He would later a retired colonel, full colonel. But he was my medic, and he said he was never so surprised in all his life after that smoke had cleared to see me still standing.
And so did you fight for the rest of that day, were you told?
I don't know. I absolutely don't know. I have no memory.
So you were captured that day?
I came to in a prison camp.
In Poland?
That's before my memory stayed with me. As I say, I had flashes. I can remember a flash of a little town, a little village up on the mountainside. I suppose must have been in the Alps. And the sun was shining on it. It was a rainy day. I don't know where it was. I don't know anything about it, but I remember that village in that sunshine.
How long? I mean, how long a span of time between the Anzio catastrophe and your memory catching up to you?
I would say a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. Because when we came into Poland, it was my coming back is sort of a gradual thing. I remember in O Flag 64 and wondering where I was and knowing where I was, and then I would drift out, and then it would come back. And so I suspect that it was May, which would have been 3 or 4 months. It was early summer, late spring, that I realized that actually where I was, and day by day, I have a memory of what happened from then on. As I say, I can never remember hitting the ground, and I'm told that I walked around and that I was mobile, but I wasn't saying anything or doing anything, and it was a matter of those 2 or 3 weeks that when they were moving by boxcar and when they were moving or whatever means they had, they marched to the Rangers around the Coliseum and took pictures of them showing it looked like there were several thousand Rangers instead of perhaps the 200 or 300 that they had. And I'm only guessing at how many, but it looked like an endless column going around the Coliseum, and I've seen the footage of that. But I have no memory of that. I have no memory of the boxcars that they tell me about and the misery of it and the crowded facilities. I have no memory of that. Now, I have been asked if I would undergo hypnotism to remember it. And my answer to that is, why in hell do I want to get that kind of a memory back? You know. So I just as soon forget about it, but anyway, that's the way it is. Well, the one I can tell you about was they moved us out of O Flag 64, which was in northern Poland. And the Russians were advancing, and they moved us out of where we were at ahead of the Russians. A man by the name of Kenny Kerfoot, I think he might have had a little Oklahoma Indian in him. I don't know that. Another little Dago Italian from Virginia by the name of Tony Liberatore. The three of us walked away from the column and hid out. But there was a major battle developed overhead. We were headed for the Russian lines. We hid out in a potato cellar in the middle of a field. Now, that's potato country, and the way they save their potatoes through the year were to put them in a potato cellar because the winters get bitter. So these potato cellars would never really freeze. I could best explain it by go sit in a refrigerator for a long time. That's about what it would be like. And yes, we were cold, and a Polish family found us there and put us in, brought us overcoats and other clothes, what have you. And the battle raged on, and eventually the Germans threw the Russians back temporarily and put their command post in our potato cellar, and that's how I was recaptured the second time. Nothing glamorous. But this time I was in civilian clothes, and so they tried me as a spy, which was nothing glamorous about that. It was perfunctory, and sentenced to be shot April 22nd, sticks in my mind, of 1945. And you must remember war was over with May 8th in Europe. So they sentenced me to be shot, and that's when I escaped the third time. We were in Luckenwald, not to be mistaken with the famous Buchenwald, but the Luckenwald. And in there, they had some Norwegian political prisoners. When they took over Norway, Germany, they brought back the people who would not cooperate, and they were political prisoners. And they were kept in this concentration camp. But they didn't count them as they did the soldier military personnel. They'd line you up 5 deep. Then they'd come home here, Irons Fire Drive here, and if anyone was missing, why, then they'd find out who it was, and they'd have the dogs on their trail right now. But we infiltrated a couple of the Norwegian soldiers into our place in line, and a man by the name of Pete Vetcher and I walked away from that camp. And I think I told you that I don't think they know we're gone yet. It was that easy. And that's when we made our way then to the Elbe River, and that's where we got in with the Fifth Army. Now, they weren't going to believe me for a while because, you see, the Germans were infiltrating into the American lines in American uniforms. And so they took me back to the headquarters and put me through quite rigorous tests until they decided that I was what I said I was. And that's why I was in the headquarters. Now, Petey Vetcher and I were separated then because he was an enlisted man, so he went one way and they took me into the headquarters.
Quite a relief for 2.5 years of combat. POW for how long?
15 months, let's say. Overall, everything, 15 months. I think the thing that makes me the most proud of having been a ranger is to look at the new rangers. You say you've worked with them. If you've worked with them, I think that you have to sense the difference between a ranger and the average soldier. There's something special about them. And so when I see that something special, I'm proud of having been a ranger and proud of the fact that I'm part of their history and proud of the fact that they think they have to live up to me, if you understand what I mean. After the war was over with and they discontinued the Rangers because of the difficult training. But then, 1974, they reactivated because they found out that really they couldn't do without that type of an organization. I think up until then they had done it differently. They had given Ranger training at Fort Benning to what they call the Airborne Rangers in Korea. Then you had the Green Berets in Vietnam.
Here in Vietnam.
And then they found out that they needed that type of person. So in 1974, they reactivated the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is made up of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd battalions now. And I'm proud to say that I am their honorary sergeant major. I suspect the biggest reason for that is that I'm the only sergeant major left, and also by virtue of having been the first sergeant major. It wasn't because of anything exceptional, but I'm still proud of being their sergeant major, honorary. When you've gone through as much as you have and trained as hard as you have, and then they discontinued it, you realize that no one was ever going to know or ever feel the essence of what it was and what it is to be a ranger. It was forgotten. Now, you see, Normandy, if it hadn't been for Normandy and the 2nd Ranger Battalion and the 5th Ranger Battalion, no one would probably ever have known that there were Rangers. They might have. But now, you see, because of them, the 2nd and the 5th Battalion, and the 6th Battalion also in Carbonatuan, individually, we weren't much, but collectively, we were a bunch of damn heroes. But that would have been forgotten if it hadn't been reactivated in 74. And then the Rangers that have come since then have perpetuated the memory and the magic of what it was to be a Ranger. Otherwise, it would have been forgotten. Let's don't kid ourselves. I think Perhaps you're getting close now to the common thread that makes a ranger something special. I think that common thread is a deep and vibrant belief in something bigger than you are. The rangers that are left, the Les Knesses, the Bing Evanses, the Ed Deans, I can name them. The common thread that I see left in those fellows is that they're all deeply religious. Now, this didn't start out to be a religious program, but there seems to be a strong inner confidence in the faith of the inner man. And I think if you don't have that, you're not going to be a good ranger. Of a real, honest-to-goodness pride. They're a breed of their own, like I like to think that the old rangers were. The difference is, I think we were lean and hungry coming out of the Depression, and the new ranger is bigger, more powerful, has weight training program, has had a good diet, has been fed, where as a commando we were fed kippered herring. These boys are fed steaks. I'm using that as an example. But they are different in that respect. We were the lean greyhound type, and these guys are as fast as were, but they're one of your comic strip muscle men, Superman. I was on a football scholarship at South Dakota State. I'd been at the University of Minnesota before that, but they wouldn't let me into the university. Now, of course, they can't do that because of the NCAA rulings. But I was a fairly decent football player, and I was a pretty big man. But I was a skinny 225 pounds as a big man, and now you look at these boys today, and what do you see? 260, 270? What's the Great Dane? 260 pounds of speed, muscle, and power?
253.
Yeah. So this is the difference between the old Rangers and the new Rangers. They're really bigger, more powerful. I don't know that they're faster. I think that they've been imbued with the Ranger spirit. I think that they really try to live up to it, for the most part. No other branch of the service is going to be asked to do the same things that the Rangers will do. Let's take today, Grenada. Who was it that they sent into Grenada? It was the Rangers. Who was it that had the most difficult part of Panama? It was the Rangers. Who was it that did the behind-the-lines work in Desert Storm? It was the Rangers. Yeah, you'd better be ready to live a life of danger if you're a Ranger. Hey, that makes good poetry, doesn't it? Recognizing that I volunteered as a Ranger, fully knowing the hazards of my chosen profession, I will always endeavor to uphold the prestige, honor, and high esprit de corps of my Ranger regiment. Acknowledging the fact that a Ranger is a more elite soldier who arrives at the cutting edge of battle by land, sea, or air, I accept the fact that as a Ranger, my country expects me to move farther, faster, and fight harder than any other soldier. Never shall I fail my comrades. I will always keep myself mentally alert, physically strong, and morally straight, and I will shoulder more than my share of the task, whatever it may be, 100%, and then some. I appreciate what you've done today, and I hope that the people who see this recognize the fiber, I call it the essence of being a Ranger. And yet, if I were to say perhaps something that you haven't asked me today, I would say the fact that the Rangers have fought through, I believe, 11 different campaigns since World War II. That the Rangers have spearheaded every invasion that's been made. That the Rangers have fought just about every battle of every one of those campaigns. That the Rangers have had more patrols, active patrols, in and around and behind the enemy lines and probably the rest of the service put together. That there are perhaps a half a dozen that you should be interviewing in my place who, those half a dozen that are left alive, have probably had more days of combat than anyone in the United States Army ever. And I don't think yet that you've quite captured that.
That was Captain Warren Bing Evans. Thanks for listening to Warriors in Their Own Words. If you have any feedback, please email the team at kharbaugh@evergreenpodcasts.com. We're always looking to improve the show. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review. Warriors in Their Own Words is a production of Evergreen Podcasts in partnership with the Honor Project. Our producer is Declan Roars. Bridget Coyne is our production director, and Sean Rule-Hoffman is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Evergreen executive producers Joan Andrews, Michael DeAloia, and David Moss. I'm Ken Harbaugh, and this is Warriors in Their Own Words.
Step back in time and discover the untold stories of history's greatest heroes. From ancient civilizations to modern times, the Anthology of Heroes podcast takes you on a journey through history, uncovering the bravery and determination of those who stood up for what they believed in. These aren't just stories from old history books, they're the human experiences of those who fought for justice, freedom, and their principles. From the defiance of Vercingetorix as he stood against Rome, to the unwavering spirit of Skanderbeg as he faced down the Ottoman Empire, each episode is a journey through their life as we follow their triumphs and their failures. Meticulously researched with quotes and observations from primary sources, Anthology of Heroes is the perfect blend of expert research and engaging storytelling. So listen and subscribe now on your favorite podcasting app.